It all began when I decided to take the shortcut home through the old, abandoned railway tunnel, a path I'd avoided since childhood but which seemed like a good idea after missing the last bus. As I entered, the air grew colder, and the darkness felt almost palpable, pressing against my skin. I tried to ignore the whispering echoes that seemed to come from all around, telling me to turn back, but curiosity and a stubborn resolve kept me moving forward. The tunnel was longer than I remembered, each step echoing off the damp walls, until I noticed a faint light flickering ahead. Relieved, I quickened my pace, hoping it was just a street lamp shining through the tunnel's exit. As I drew nearer, the light grew brighter, and I began to hear what sounded like muffled voices, distorted and indecipherable, carried on the wind. When I finally reached the source of the light, I found an old, decrepit carnival tent set up in the middle of the tunnel. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. The tent flaps were slightly ajar, and I could see shadows moving inside. Hesitantly, I stepped through the flaps, finding myself in a seemingly abandoned carnival ground. The carousel in the center of the tent was eerily still, its horses frozen in mid-gallop. The music box that usually played a cheerful tune was silent, but the haunting melody of an old fairground song began to play by itself, and the carousel slowly started to turn. I felt a chill run down my spine as I noticed the faces of the painted horses seemed to be watching me. A carnival barker appeared from the shadows, his grin too wide and eyes too dark. He welcomed me in a voice that sounded like nails on a chalkboard and handed me a faded ticket with no date. Before I could react, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the eerie carnival. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and I noticed that the carnival tents around me were filled with grotesque mannequins dressed in tattered circus costumes. Their eyes, which were little more than holes, seemed to follow my every movement. I turned to leave, but the entrance I had come through had vanished, replaced by an endless row of tents, each more unsettling than the last. The whispers grew louder, blending with the carnival music into a cacophony of unintelligible babble. I stumbled through the maze of tents, trying to find an exit, but each turn only led me deeper into the heart of the twisted carnival. The laughter of unseen clowns echoed around me, and I could feel their presence lurking just out of sight. In one tent, I found a mirror covered in grime. As I wiped it clean, my reflection was not my own but a grotesque version with hollow eyes and a sinister grin. The reflection began to move independently, reaching out of the mirror towards me. I backed away, but the mirror seemed to distort and warp, and the reflection stepped out into the tent. Desperate, I fled through the maze of grotesque tents, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled upon a tent with a large, gaping hole in its side. Without thinking, I crawled through it, emerging into a dimly lit clearing in the tunnel. The carnival music had stopped, and the oppressive silence was almost worse. As I tried to catch my breath, I noticed that the walls of the tunnel were now covered in strange, indecipherable symbols and patterns, pulsing with a faint, eerie glow. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, and no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find a way out. The whispers began again, this time more urgent and desperate, as if they were trying to warn me or perhaps plead for help. My sense of time became warped, and the tunnel seemed to shift around me, creating an unending loop of terror. I could see shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. I reached a point where I was no longer sure if I was walking in circles or if the tunnel itself was shifting and changing. Exhaustion set in, and I began to lose hope of ever escaping. The carnival's distorted laughter returned, growing louder and more insistent, as if it were mocking my plight. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, I pushed through a wall of darkness, emerging into what seemed like an old, abandoned railway yard. Relief washed over me, but as I looked around, I realized that everything was eerily still and silent. The familiar sights of the world seemed to be distorted, twisted into a nightmarish version of reality. As I took a tentative step forward, I heard a voice behind me, whispering my name in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I turned around to see the carnival barker standing there, his grin wider than ever. He gestured towards the darkened tunnel I had just escaped from, and with a sinking feeling, I realized that the nightmare was far from over. I took off running, driven by sheer panic, with no idea where I was heading. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew ever stronger. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I found myself questioning if I would ever truly escape the malevolent carnival that seemed to have no end. As the hours passed, I stumbled through a landscape that seemed to shift and change with every step, the echoes of the carnival's twisted amusement haunting my every moment. The more I tried to escape, the more the nightmare seemed to envelop me, leaving me trapped in a perpetual state of terror. The once familiar world had become a labyrinth of fear, and the realization set in that I might never truly find my way out. The carnival's twisted laughter echoed in my ears, a chilling reminder that I was forever caught in its malevolent grip, a victim of its eternal, nightmarish game. And as I wandered endlessly through the shifting landscape, the lines between dream and reality became indistinguishable, leaving me to question if I would ever escape the horrors that lurked within the darkness. The night I first heard the whispers, I was alone in the house, the kind of solitude that seeps into your bones and makes you question every creak and groan of the old wooden structure. It was just past midnight, the kind of time when silence becomes an entity all its own. I had been reading a book, one of those thriller novels that seem to know exactly how to keep you turning pages until the small hours, but the words had started to blur as fatigue set in. That's when the whispers began. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves or the distant murmur of an argument you can't quite make out. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the house settling or perhaps a draft sneaking through the old windows. But then it grew louder, more insistent. The whispers weren't coming from outside, they were inside my head, a soft, eerie chorus of voices that seemed to be just beyond my comprehension. I stood up, my heart racing, and tried to follow the sound. It led me to the basement door. The basement had always been a source of unease for me, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets and boxes of forgotten memories. The whispers grew more distinct as I descended the creaky stairs, becoming a cacophony of frantic murmurs and fragmented sentences that made no sense. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the air was thick with an unnatural chill. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but there was nothing out of place, or at least nothing I could see. As I turned to leave, a sudden movement caught my eye. A shadow, dark and formless, seemed to shift just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly falling over an old trunk. The whispers crescendoed into a piercing scream that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the basement. And then, I saw it, a figure, barely visible but unmistakably human, standing in the corner, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intensity. I fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. Days passed, and though I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, the whispers continued. They were not constant but came and went, always when I was alone. I began to dread being alone in the house, my mind racing with paranoia and fear. I sought help, but when the experts came, they found nothing, no disturbances, no paranormal activity. I felt like I was losing my mind. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to research the history of the house. What I found was disturbing. Previous owners had reported similar experiences, but none had lasted long enough to investigate thoroughly. The final owner, a woman named Eleanor, had vanished without a trace. Her disappearance was ruled an accident, but there were rumors of dark rituals and occult practices. One night, driven by desperation and fear, I returned to the basement. I confronted the shadows and the whispers, demanding answers. The air was oppressive, and the temperature had dropped even further. As I stood there, the figure reappeared, and this time, it spoke. The voice was a dissonant blend of all the whispers I had heard, telling me of a curse placed upon the house and its occupants. The figure claimed that to break the curse, someone had to take Eleanor's place. The idea of sacrificing myself to free the house seemed both absurd and terrifying. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, driving me to the brink of madness. I felt trapped in a nightmarish cycle with no escape. As I struggled with the decision, the whispers intensified, filling my mind with visions of horror and despair. In the end, it was a choice I felt I had no power to refuse. The night I performed the ritual, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the shadows seemed to writhe with anticipation. I followed the instructions, chilling and precise, hoping that by completing the ritual, I could end the torment once and for all. As the final incantation left my lips, I felt a cold, consuming darkness envelop me, and then silence. The house is still there, and the whispers continue, though they are quieter now. They have a new voice, mine. I am part of the house now, forever bound to the whispers that fill its walls. The cycle continues, and those who come after me will hear the whispers, just as I did, and they will face the same choice. The house, it seems, is never truly free, and neither am I. When I first laid eyes on the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, its peeling paint and overgrown yard seemed to whisper secrets of a bygone era. I had been searching for a new home, a place to escape the relentless grind of city life, and something about the house's dilapidated charm beckoned to me. The realtor's hurried assurances about its structural integrity and its intriguing, albeit tragic, history did little to dissuade me. My curiosity overruled my caution, and before long, I found myself moving into a house that had been abandoned for decades. The first night was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your senses hyper-aware of every sound, the distant creak of the house settling, the faint rustling of wind through the broken window panes. I chalked it up to the house's age and my own apprehensive imagination. But as the days passed, those innocent noises began to shift. Shadows in the corners of my vision seemed to move just out of sight, and the whispers, subtle at first, grew louder, more distinct. They were soft, like the rustling of leaves or the murmur of a conversation held just beyond my understanding. I convinced myself it was just the isolation getting to me, a product of living alone in a house with more history than I cared to delve into. However, the whispers persisted, and their nature grew darker. I found myself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone, or something, was watching me. Objects in the house began to shift inexplicably. The old grandfather clock in the hallway would chime at odd hours, its pendulum swinging with an almost mocking regularity. At first, I thought it was a mechanical fault, but as I spent more time in the house, I noticed a pattern to the disturbances. It was as if the house was trying to communicate. One night, after a particularly unsettling evening of unexplained noises and cold spots, I decided to investigate the attic. The stairs leading up to it were narrow and steep, and as I climbed them, I could feel the temperature dropping. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, dusty trunks, and decaying books. Amid the clutter, I discovered a large, ornate mirror covered with a sheet. My hands trembled as I pulled the sheet away, revealing a reflection that was eerily distorted, like a funhouse mirror but with a more sinister edge. As I stared into the mirror, I saw movement behind me. When I turned, there was nothing but the scattered remnants of the attic's forgotten contents. My heart raced, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to echo from within the walls themselves. I quickly covered the mirror and left the attic, vowing not to return. But the sense of unease only grew stronger. The next day, I researched the house's history in the local archives. I learned that the previous owners had experienced similar disturbances, but none had stayed long enough to investigate. The most unsettling detail was the house's tragic past. A family had once lived there, and their youngest child had mysteriously vanished. The case was never solved, and rumors of a curse had surrounded the house ever since. The more I learned, the more I realized that the whispers were not merely figments of my imagination, they were echoes of something far more malevolent. Determined to understand the source of the disturbances, I began to explore the house more thoroughly. I found a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement. It was filled with strange symbols and old, yellowed manuscripts. As I examined the manuscripts, I realized they were accounts of occult practices and rituals. The symbols on the walls matched those in the manuscripts, and a chilling realization dawned on me: someone had been conducting dark rituals in the house, possibly to contact or appease something from beyond. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, and the whispers began to take on a more discernible form. They were no longer random murmurs but fragmented sentences, pleading and accusing. It became clear that whatever was haunting the house was trying to communicate something, but its messages were shrouded in cryptic phrases and unsettling tones. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the room was filled with an icy chill. I felt a presence, an invisible weight pressing down on me. The whispers were now a cacophony of anguished voices, each one a fragment of a larger, more malevolent consciousness. I tried to decipher their messages, but they remained maddeningly elusive. In a desperate attempt to break free from the house's grip, I decided to perform a cleansing ritual based on the information I had gathered. I followed the instructions meticulously, hoping to expel whatever dark force was lingering in the house. As I completed the final incantation, the house seemed to come alive with a violent energy. The walls shook, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. I felt as though the very foundation of the house was trembling. Suddenly, the noise ceased. The house fell into a deep, eerie silence. Exhausted and terrified, I collapsed on the floor, hoping that the ordeal was finally over. But as I looked around the room, I realized that the whispers had not disappeared. They had become a part of me, an inescapable echo that I could not silence. The next morning, I awoke to find the house seemingly calm, but the whispers had left a permanent mark on my psyche. They were no longer just sounds, they were voices in my head, a constant reminder of the darkness that had been unleashed. I decided to leave the house, but no matter where I went, the whispers followed. They were a part of me now, a haunting presence that I could never escape. The house stands empty once again, a silent witness to the horrors that transpired within its walls. But the whispers live on, a chilling reminder of the malevolent force that lurks just beyond the veil of reality. And though I have moved on, I know that I will never truly escape the shadows of the forgotten house. I had never seen a house quite like the one I inherited from my estranged uncle. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, it stood like a relic from another era, shrouded in an eerie fog that never seemed to lift. The will had come as a surprise. My uncle had been a recluse, and I hadn't seen him in years. I was curious about the inheritance and the mysterious man I barely remembered, so I decided to visit the house. The drive was long and arduous, and the narrow, winding road was overgrown with vines and brambles. When I finally arrived, the house seemed to loom out of the mist, its once grand facade now weathered and grim. The windows were dark, the shutters hanging askew, and the door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and the faintest hint of mildew. The house was a maze of cobwebbed rooms and forgotten furniture draped in white sheets. The first few days were uneventful. I busied myself with cleaning and unpacking, trying to ignore the chill that seemed to permeate the house. It wasn't until the third night that things started to get strange. As I lay in bed, the house seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional groan of the floorboards. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. I dismissed it as the house's natural creaks and shifts, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Determined to find the source, I got up and followed the noise through the darkened hallways. It led me to the basement door, which I had yet to explore. The basement was cold, its air heavy and damp. I fumbled for the light switch, and as the bulb flickered to life, I saw it, a large, antique lantern hanging from the ceiling, its glass panes coated in layers of dust. The lantern's flame was dim but steady, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I couldn't recall lighting it, and yet it was burning. As I reached for the lantern, I noticed something odd etched into its base, strange symbols and a name, Lydia Hawkins. The name seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. The moment I touched the lantern, a chill ran down my spine. The tapping noise ceased abruptly, replaced by a soft, mournful wail that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Unable to shake the sense of dread, I left the basement and went back to bed. But sleep eluded me. The house was alive with whispers, voices that seemed to echo from every corner, murmuring in an unintelligible language. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to go about my day, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The next night, the tapping returned, louder and more urgent. This time, I descended into the basement with more determination. The lantern was still burning, but the symbols on its base seemed to have changed, shifting into new and unfamiliar patterns. The air around the lantern grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, forming discernible words that seemed to beckon me closer. One evening, I found a dusty old journal hidden among the cobwebs in a corner of the basement. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were filled with scrawled notes and drawings. As I flipped through the pages, a disturbing pattern emerged. The journal belonged to Lydia Hawkins, a woman who had lived in the house many years ago. Her entries spoke of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, shadows that moved on their own, and a growing sense of dread. She had been obsessed with the lantern, believing it to be a conduit to another realm, and her final entries were frantic, pleading for someone to destroy it before it was too late. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of Lydia's fear and desperation. I resolved to confront whatever was haunting the house. That night, I took the lantern outside and placed it in the garden, intending to destroy it. But as I prepared to set it alight, the whispers returned, more insistent than ever. They were no longer just in the background, they were in my head, urging me to stop, to bring the lantern back inside. I hesitated, torn between the journal's warnings and the overwhelming pressure to obey the whispers. Eventually, I brought the lantern back inside, placing it on the mantelpiece in the living room. The whispers subsided, but the sense of foreboding remained. Over the next few days, the house seemed to shift, as if reacting to my decision. Rooms felt colder, shadows seemed to lengthen, and the whispers continued, though they were now accompanied by fleeting glimpses of a figure moving just out of sight. The figure appeared to be a woman, her face obscured by shadows. I realized that Lydia's presence was still very much alive in the house, and the lantern was the focal point of her torment. Desperate to find a solution, I sought help from a local historian who knew about the house's history. She confirmed my fears. Lydia Hawkins had indeed been a victim of a dark ritual gone wrong, and the lantern was a key element in the curse that had bound her to the house. The historian suggested that the only way to break the curse was to perform a counter-ritual, one that involved both destroying the lantern and freeing Lydia's spirit. That night, I prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary items as instructed. The lantern was placed in the center of the room, surrounded by candles and symbols drawn in salt. As I began the ritual, the house seemed to come alive with a sinister energy. The shadows danced, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of anguished cries. As I completed the final incantation, the lantern's flame flared wildly, casting blinding light across the room. I could feel a presence, powerful and ancient, struggling to break free. The lantern shattered, and an icy wind swept through the house. The whispers turned into a single, mournful wail before abruptly falling silent. The house fell into an oppressive stillness. Exhausted, I collapsed on the floor, feeling a strange sense of peace. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the house seemed lighter, as though a great weight had been removed. Lydia Hawkins' spirit had been freed, and the lantern's curse had been broken. I spent the following days preparing the house for sale, the whispers and shadows now a distant memory. The house was no longer a place of fear but a relic of a past that was finally at peace. As I left for the last time, I felt a sense of relief, knowing that the lantern's dark influence had been vanquished. The house, now silent, stood as a testament to the horrors that had once lurked within its walls, a reminder of the darkness that can be conquered with courage and resolve.